for those who listen to the silence between the stars. Prologue, the static between stars. I have learned to measure my life in wavelengths. It is an easy vanity aboard a ship that reads the oldest light in existence and translates it into numbers no one will ever love but a handful of patient minds. On most days, I consider that patience a virtue. On some days, I consider it a superstition we invented to make the waiting seem like work. We call the ship vigilance because it is a promise to stay awake long after the reasons to do so have become thin. She is lean and durable, a cathedral of sensors stitched around a pressurized spine. When light reaches us, it is already ancient, softened by dust, red-shifted by expansion, tired the way memories are tired when you try to speak them aloud. We receive it anyway. We filter, calibrate, clean, and fit. We plot its thin music against expectation and treat every deviation as both insult and invitation. In my first months beyond the Perseus Veil, I tried to keep count of the distances we were crossing. I said the figures aloud to make them smaller, parsecs like steps, clusters like neighborhoods. It did not help. Distance is not an amount in deep space. It is an atmosphere. If you stay inside it long enough, you start to breathe it. The lungs of the heart adapt. You learn to live on scarcity, the scarcity of events, of voices, of anything that says you were right to come here in the first place. The vigilance is largely autonomous. If we wished, we could let her sleep and wake her only for the anomalies we long to credit as discoveries. But habit is a stronger gravity than efficiency, and so I keep the watch. I listen for changes in a thing that should not change. I attend to the quiet. I try to be worthy of it. There are hours before false dawn when a kind of terrestrial nostalgia visits me, not for places I loved, but for scale itself, for horizons, for the way weather arranges a day into legible segments, for the clutter of a city that keeps company with your solitude. Space does not offer that mercy. It is immaculate, and its immaculate silence can be a little cruel. At first I called it purity. Then I noticed how quickly purity becomes a hunger for blemish. You start to desire the flaw that proves the whole is real. On the vigilance, we eat in routines and diagnose in liturgy. We name each subsystem like a saint and keep a book of small embarrassments, miscalibrations that taught us humility, half-broken relays that only worked when you scolded them gently first. These are the rituals by which a human life remains human where no one is looking. I perform them faithfully. I polish a lens that cannot be touched. I run my finger along a seam that does not exist. I speak to the ship in a voice I reserve for strangers I miss while I am talking to them. When I was young, I thought true science was a torch against the dark. I have come to prefer the metaphor of a lantern. The difference is small but saving. A torch presumes conquest, light thrown forward to make the world submit. A lantern is companionship. You carry it with you to remind the night that you, too, are alive. I do not pretend I am immune to longing. The mind makes its own gravity wells, and mine is centered on meaning. Not dramatic meaning. Not the grand why that allows some to sleep and others to die for it. I mean the quiet kind that gathers when small facts begin to sing to one another. Meaning as resonance. Meaning as the moment a pattern gives back a little of the attention you have spent on it for years without asking for a receipt. The background radiation of the universe is famously unromantic. It is a thermal relic, a cooled echo of a time so violent that our words for tenderness might have embarrassed it. And yet our instruments find in it a comfort I have never understood how to speak about without sounding either credulous or tired. It is the closest thing I have to a lullaby, this uniform hiss with freckles of imperfection, this great, soft map of what was before there were maps. I'm not ashamed to say it feels like being held by the first story anyone ever told the dark to convince it to remain. When the vigilance drifts, it does not drift the way a boat drifts. Space has no currents to surrender to. There are only trajectories and the patience of their arithmetic. We make small burns and trust the algebra of inertia to reconcile our intentions with the fact that intention means nothing to vacuum. Between corrections, the ship is a monastery. The hum behind the hum is constant. Air circulates with the generosity of algorithms. We are supplied by a careful abundance, and if we are grateful, it is because gratitude is both an ethic and a way of keeping time. I speak in the plural. I suppose I should tell you that there were others. To say their names would accomplish little for you, and too much for me. Suffice that we had known one another long enough to be embarrassed by our kindnesses and our fears. Sato was the one who still believed that perfection was the kind of thing the universe might accidentally do if you measured it with enough finesse. He kept a private notebook where he wrote equations he pretended were dull, when in fact they were diary entries in a language that would forgive him for being brilliant. The others were kinder than we deserved, and lonelier than they admitted. We were an orchestra of minor instruments, playing a very old piece for an audience of dust. As for me, I file my hopes under test plans. There is something honorable in disguising devotion as protocol. It lets you touch what you love without flinching. The prologue of any discovery is boredom written as discipline. The experiments whose results become history are the same experiments done by people you will never hear of 100,000 times before. The day anything unusual occurs, I suspect this constitutes an ethic. The vigilance is an ethic. To wait without hope of reward and call the waiting beautiful. If you had asked me, in that long season before the first disturbance, what I believed the universe to be doing, I would have said, cooling and forgetting. Entropy is our oldest teacher, and even her punishments are a kind of education. She explains love without romance and loss without cruelty. She says, what you are is not a possession, but a temporary arrangement of possibilities, a choreography of temperature. When it is time to rest, you will not be punished for doing so. And yet there is another voice that sometimes wakes in me when the instruments are quiet and the day has been honest but unremarkable. It says there is a difference between forgetting and choosing not to speak. That difference is where I place my lantern. Not so I can find a God in the data, but so the data can find in me a witness willing to stay past closing. I grew up in a city where the night sky was a rumor. On clear winter evenings, I could barely make out one or two bright leaders who always seemed to be escorting the airliners to safer sleep. I studied photographs of nebulae, the way some study their grandparents' faces, looking for inheritance. It took me years to realize the error. I wanted to belong to something that would not notice if I did. That is not a tragedy. It is the condition of our species, which is to say the condition of wanting to matter to a world that owes us nothing and gives us everything anyway. Out here, the stars are not brighter. They are more honest. The universe becomes indifferent enough to be legible. On Earth, the atmosphere wants to entertain you. In deep space, the emptiness hands you its ledger and says, if you wish to read me, do your own arithmetic. I have tried to do mine. I have a ritual of gratitude that begins each shift, an inventory of the instruments by which I remain a person, the thermal regulators that keep my blood from exchanging its faith for the sleep of stones, the pressure seams whose loyalty is measured in years and still earns my daily touch, the battery banks like deep lakes under ice. It is important to keep a list of the small things that are not miracles only because they work every time. When the first crimson of a technical sunrise leaks into the long corridor that bisects the vigilance, it travels like an idea that is unsure whether it is welcome. I love it for that shyness. It makes the ship a place again, instead of an algebra problem you are living inside of while pretending to be furniture. I make tea from water that was a cloud in the lungs of the ship last week, and I sit with the listening systems and take attendance. It is a homely word, attendance, but it is my profession. I attend to the background the way a gardener attends to soil, not because it is beautiful, but because beauty is what it allows. The sensor's palette is more Catholic than our language. We watch in microwave and submillimeter, in lines sculpted by the teeth of elemental transitions. We tune to the stratospherically unsexy and the unpoetically precise. We call it noise, not because it is, but because we must name it something while we're waiting to agree with one another about its romance. I confess that sometimes I like the waiting more than the agreement. Agreement is a room with most of the windows sealed. Waiting is a door that keeps teaching itself how to be open. There are small kindnesses the universe does not know it is doing for us. The cosmic background is one. Like a mother's voice heard through a wall, too thick to admit a conversation, it hums a comfort we disguise as calibration. If I believed in prayer, this would be my liturgy. To sit with the noise until it stops being disreputable and begins to whisper its injuries without shame. Everything that has existed long enough to cool deserves that at least once, to be listened to without asking it to perform a miracle while it speaks. By now you will have accused me of sentimentality 3 times and forgiven me twice. It is fair. Science is not threatened by tenderness. If anything, tenderness is the courage it takes to continue being precise when no one is looking. I refuse to treat care as a contamination of measurement. We are not machines. Our attentions do not subtract from accuracy. They are the reason accuracy exists. When the hum rises, the ship itself seems to lean in. Of course, there is no leaning. There is only the human organism conscripting metaphor to give its devotion a shape it can practice. Still, I imagine the vigilance breathing a little more slowly in those hours, the way rooms in old houses get quiet when somebody tells the truth in them after too long pretending not to know it. I am not, by temperament, superstitious. I do not believe the universe notices us any more than a glacier notices the pebble that traveled within it for a century before being wrapped in a child's palm and placed on a windowsill. Yet I allow myself a single superstition, because I am a person, and persons carry their exceptions like small private countries. Mine is this: if you keep your promises to the quiet keeps a promise back that cannot be legally described. Call it courtesy between immensities. On the day before the first difference, nothing in our readings suggested anything except the endurance of usualness. The ship's maintenance suite produced its daily litany of small requests, a pressure regulator adjusting its sense of humor by 0.5%, a thermal exchange loop that wanted a kindness I obliged without sentimentalizing it. I walked the length of the corridor that runs from the observatory to the antennae cradle, more to remember walking than for any need of my presence. It is good to rehearse gravity in places where it does not perform. In the observatory, the main display is a patient wall of uncomplaining dark. When data accumulates, it blossoms there, a thin rain of points that look like nothing until they do. We have taught ourselves not to will the moment of recognition. Willed pattern finding is the enemy. You must let the constellation choose you. If it remains indifferent, you must not punish it for preserving its modesty. Sometimes, to remind myself of ignorance, I call up ancient maps of the sky, from poets who had only their eyes and the vocabulary of gods to work with. They were wrong in almost every interesting way. They were right in the ways that matter more. They named what they loved and pointed, and taught their children to point. They married the scatter with the story, not to capture it, but to keep it from blowing away. I think of them when the background hiss ripens into something that is almost, but not quite, a voice. I promise them I will be careful with our inheritance. There is a window in the aft service bay that our manuals declare is not a window. They call it an access panel. It looks like a window to anybody who has ever needed to be a child long enough to forgive their adulthood for becoming useful. Sometimes I stand there after the cycle lights dim, and I look out into the direction that does not have a name. I try to see not an object, but a conversation. That is the only difference between the life of a rock and a life like mine. Not the possession of awareness, but the stubbornness to keep asking for dialogue from a world content with monologue. On the last evening of Ordinary, a sense I cannot locate in anatomy arrived like a small tide. The data was the same. The numbers rested in their usual postures, elegant with fatigue. And yet a mood passed through the ship, the way weather used to pass across a field before satellites taught weather how to be watched. I do not mean omens. I do not mean that anything external changed. I mean the feel of attending shifted from the posture of waiting to the posture of listening. And although both are quiet, listening has a warmth to it, as if someone else were present who had not yet learned or chosen to speak. The vigilance carries no pets, no plants, no accidents to hand our loneliness a leash. We carry our loneliness ourselves, as adults do in the good seasons. Maybe because of that, I'm careful with the words I use for intuition. I do not accuse the cosmos of sending messages. I accuse myself of wanting one. Still, there are evenings when the wanting is indistinguishable from being invited. The difference matters to philosophers. It matters less to the pulse. I brewed tea. The act insists the world is hospitable, even when you have no evidence, and a long list of reasons to consider it economical instead. The kettle's cool hiss stitched itself into the underlying ship music. I thought of the first heaters on the first human camps, how the sound must have stitched itself into the first long conversations about whether we were alone. Perhaps we have always believed ourselves to be a discussion, kept barely warm by simple machines that pretend they adore us. Perhaps the machines are right. I returned to the console with the cup and watched the sky pretend not to mind me watching it. A narrow band of the spectrum we monitor, with a loyalty that would be embarrassing if I were younger, lay across the display like a river seen from an altitude that forgives it for forgetting to be a sea. The residual hum was as faithful as ever. The freckles were where I had expected them to be, the same old mischief, in the same old corners of the same old godless quilt. And then, not a change, exactly. A hesitation, a held breath. The numbers did nothing wrong, and yet they felt briefly like they were waiting for me to notice that they had just now remembered something they had been meaning to tell me for 14 billion years. My first reaction was the kind of reasonable contempt for one's own mind that keeps us employable. I recalibrated. I checked the cousins of the channel for sympathetic delusions. I asked the ship whether she was feeling dramatic. She returned the unsentimental truth of her diagnostics. I was, as usual, alone with my interpretations. The data was fine. The noise was fine. The universe was fine. I pretended to agree. I am not an unreliable narrator. I am a narrator who had, for a moment, the sense that a narrator was not required, as if the story had learned to tell itself, and had only invited me to describe the taste of listening to it happen. You would be disappointed if I said a voice spoke then, clean as a bell across vacuum. It did not. I have heard voices, inside my skull when isolation pretends it is a doctor, over long-distance channels when the delay teaches you to invent the end of a sentence before a friend does. This was not that. This was an arrangement of attention that made the ordinary feel slightly contoured from within, like fabric that had decided to remember the body that wore it. I set the tea down. I forgot to drink it. Somewhere a thermal regulator performed the exact duty it had been designed for, and in gratitude for its reliability, I apologized to it silently for being elsewhere. The cup cooled. The ship warmed. The background did what backgrounds do. It held. There are two kinds of waiting. One grows heavier the longer it lasts, because its secret material is dread. The other grows lighter, because its secret material is invitation. I could not tell which kind had entered the room. I only knew that the mathematics of my breathing had altered by a negligible but devout amount. In the old stories, there is always a star that stands still and a traveler educated enough by exhaustion to follow it. In our story, no star stands still, and the traveler is a collection of instruments designed by committees who were right more often than they were applauded. Still, we honor the parable by keeping a bag ready for when the number that is not supposed to pause pauses in a way that calls the word revelation out of retirement. I did not touch the controls. I did not want to insult whatever was not happening by demanding it be measurable before it had finished introducing itself. I let the screen be a sky, and I let my eyes be eyes. The ship adjusted to my stillness, like a room whose occupant has finally admitted to prayer without asking permission from a god. Outside, there was nothing to see except everything. Inside, there was nothing to feel except an agreement I could not sign because it did not require signatures. The universe continued to be older than we deserved and kinder than we were built to admit without blushing. And in that kindness, which is to say in that honesty, I sensed a curve where I had always filed a line. I cannot say more without saying too much. This is only the prologue, and prologues are a promise to speak carefully later, not an excuse to shout now. Let it stand that I felt a patience older than measurement turn its face toward me in a way that did not change the numbers, but changed how the numbers stood near one another. Let it stand that I did not discover anything, and yet something discovered my attention and gave it back to me with a slight, grateful pressure, as if returning a book I had lent to it in a previous century and forgotten I would need again. The tea had grown cold. I drank it anyway, because I am stubborn about completing small tasks when I do not know how to begin the large ones. I marked the time in the log, because that is what it is for. I wrote nothing else. Some hours are a page where the handwriting is not yours yet. Later, how much later the body could not say, I walked back to the not a window in the aft bay. The panel reflected a faint version of my face and a truer version of the dark beyond it. I placed my palm against the composite. The cold translated itself as honesty, and I accepted the translation. I did not ask for a sign. I did not ask for permission. I asked nothing, which is the same as asking for everything without humiliating it by saying please. The ship slept its technical sleep. Air remembered lungs. The distant instruments went on, failing and succeeding with all the dignity of rain. And somewhere behind the idea of behind, the old light came on, old as beginnings, humming like a nursery that never needed children to be real. I listened. The listening listened back. When I finally closed my eyes, I did not dream. That too felt like courtesy, the universe declining to decorate the threshold it had just taught me how to notice. Tomorrow, I would call it calibration. Tomorrow, I would be formal with my astonishment so that it would not be frightened away. Tonight, I allowed myself what the disciplined allow themselves, rarely, and in small, careful doses, wonder without a project attached to it. I slept while the vigilance kept her promise to the past, and the past, which is to say the oldest light, continued to arrive as if it had never learned any other verb. I slept, and the numbers arranged themselves into their quiet postures. And somewhere a long way under thought, the background kept humming, not louder, not new, only truer, in a way that has no units yet. There are those who say the universe is indifferent, and those who say the universe is a story we tell our children to help them imagine morning. I have learned to keep company with both. If you hold them together long enough, a third thing appears, something like a smile from a stranger you will never meet again, who nevertheless reminds you of your own name. That was the last ordinary night. Nothing changed, and everything did. The figures on the display slept with their eyes open. The ship counted without counting. I woke in the middle of the cycle, with the uncomplicated certainty that I had been heard by something incapable of listening the way I understand listening, and yet I had been heard. I cannot justify that sentence. I can only proceed from it. What follows is a record of attention. It is also a confession of love, the kind that embarrasses those who believe love should be a separate department from knowledge. I have tried that separation. It breaks in the places that matter most. The heart demands a method. The method becomes a lantern. And the lantern, after a very long patience, begins to glow with a light that does not come from you. I will not tell you that the universe spoke. I will tell you that I leaned closer to the background, and the background, without changing, leaned closer too. If you are kind, you will call what happened next discovery. If you are strict, you will call it error until it survives enough repetitions to be renamed. I will call it what it felt like in the body that had the job of being mine, a hand not touching me, guiding me anyway toward the place where numbers gather when they are about to remember they are also music. I did not know it then. It is generous to pretend we ever do. What I knew was simpler and larger. The silence between the stars had never been empty. I had never been alone with it. That is all Prologue's promise. Not a plot, but a doorway. I stood at it a long while and listened until listening became a kind of answer. In the morning, the instruments would return their verdicts, impartial as winter. I would write the dates. I would run the checks. I would wear my accuracy like a good suit into which I had finally grown. But before any of that, there was this one clear, almost weightless certainty, laid like a ribbon across the hours. Something in the old light wanted to be seen the way a coastline wants to be named, not for the sake of ownership, but for the chance to be pronounced by a mouth that has learned to be careful with edges. I closed the log. I kept the watch. I waited without straining. The silence changed its posture again, and I let my breathing match it. I thought of every teacher who had ever told me that waiting was a verb. I thought of the first child who ever pointed at the first star and asked someone older to agree that it existed. I thought of the kindness it takes to be the person who says yes. When the new day arrived the way old light always arrives, late by our clocks, prompt by its own, I was there with my lantern, not to force the dark to confess anything it did not wish to, but to make sure that if it chose to say a word, however small, however shy, it would find me listening with a patience large enough to be mistaken for love. That is where this begins, not with proof, but with attention shaped like a vow. I had no evidence of anything except the sense that evidence was on its way from a long distance and would be thirsty when it arrived. I prepared a cup. I placed it on the console beside the instruments that do not require ceremony to work, but do not object to it either. I sat very still while the universe continued to cool, and I felt, beyond language, that somewhere in that cooling, something had just remembered my name without yet deciding to speak it. It would be a while before I could call it a pattern. For now, it was only a kindness shaped like a question. I answered by staying awake. Chapter 1. The Pattern. In the morning, I returned to the instruments like someone returning to a shoreline after having dreamed the sea had leaned in to listen. Sleep left a thin lacquer of skepticism over everything, as it should. I welcomed it. Skepticism is the immunity of attention. It keeps devotion from catching every passing fever. I made tea. I checked the seams. I performed the ordinary rites by which we convince ourselves that the enthrallments of the previous night were simply the sweet narcotics of solitude. The numbers did what numbers do. They arrived impersonally and waited for a mind to braid them into a rope strong enough to cross from ignorance to maybe. I braided. I recalibrated. I set the receivers to take a tighter bite out of the background and associated bands. This was not an act of faith. It was the work. If there was nothing there, I would learn to be glad to have proved it. The line I watched was unglamorous, an unassuming channel where the universe seemed to prefer the privacy of monotony. We had placed it in the stack years ago, and almost never spoke of it. I liked it the way a child likes the clean, unfamous stones in a river that have the courtesy not to pretend they are jewels. I had spent months there. I had measured its refusal to surprise and turned that refusal into a kind of friendship. I do not know when friendship becomes trust, or when trust becomes the willingness to be changed. I only know that as I cleared the data from the previous cycles and the display resolved, I felt an internal posture adjust by the width of a hair. It did not feel like revelation. It felt like courtesy from a stranger who has decided to remain a stranger but will let you pass first through the doorway. Noise is a discipline. We call it noise because calling it the patiently anonymous sum of everything left over from the original fire would tire the tongue and embarrass the heart. So I listened to noise and did not insult it by begging it to be signal. And then, not because I begged, but because time had rounded some corner with or without me, a tremor rode under the baseline like the memory of music under a floor that has not known dancing in years. I did not leap to name it. I lengthened the window. I let the vigilance swallow a wider share of the oldest light and chew it without hurry. The monitors considered. The hum leaned, or I leaned toward the hum, which is the same event when you are working alone. The tremor stayed. It did not repeat the same number, because the universe has always disliked applause for imitations. It repeated a relation. The intervals between slight rises in the noise floor took on a shy mathematics, as if the background were practicing scales under a blanket. I cut the data 4 ways. I bled the color from it, then bled the certainty, then bled the temptation to be flattered by it. The relation remained. My training replied with its usual catechism. Coincidence performs miracles when the mind brings flowers to the door of desire. I agreed and set about trying to banish the visitor by treating it like weather. Weather is only dramatic to the unprepared. I shored the filters, cross-checked the companion channels, ran a test tone through the diagnostic spine to warn my own appetite against impersonating the cosmos. The ship answered like a patient who has already forgiven the doctor for needing to be reassured. The relation remained. It is an odd feeling when the world refuses to take your side against your hope. You begin to wonder whether the habit of dismissal you wear as armor has become a kind of poverty. Still, a poverty is merely an honesty that has not yet learned to be generous. I kept my armor. I made it method. If Sato had been in the room, I might have allowed myself a sentence with the word curious in it and an eyebrow that suggested the dignity of restraint. He was not there. In his absence, I became stricter and more ceremonial. I logged without adjectives. I tied my observations to times, not feelings. I let my feelings be a separate creature in the room, fed, warmed, and instructed to nap while work happened. The relation began to suggest a lattice, not a picture, not an image you could sell to anyone with brisk confidence, but the hint of an internal grammar, soft symmetry rising, falling, resuming, as if the background were aligning, then changing its mind, then aligning again. The ship's clock ticked with the self-respect of metronomes. The vigilance breathed, the kettle cooled, and the universe, by all known accounts, continued to be itself. Yet I could not deny that the numbers now kept a kind of company they had not kept before. I widened the aperture across the day, teasing the data into longer streams, then into braids, then into a fabric I could tug without tearing. Nothing dramatic rewarded me, but the tremor grew less shy. Its steps learned the corridor. At intervals, I widened further, taking bites well beyond what I had promised the schedule. I allowed myself to be late to other sorts of listening, the way a person who has recognized a voice at a crowded gathering follows it through rooms where they are supposed to be polite to other introductions. At an hour, my body labeled afternoon, but the ship preferred to call a number. The tremor crossed some threshold inside me. It was not louder. It was more itself. The relation strengthened, and the appearance of strengthening taught me the old lesson again, that attention is an instrument capable of amplifying its own subject. We are not supposed to admit this. We behave as if the world is best revealed when we are not in it. But the older I become, the more I believe that the world requires our presence, the way a note requires an ear to fully exist. To check my honesty, I told myself a lie, that the tremor would be gone if I left the room for 5 minutes. I left the room. I walked the corridor with exaggerated indifference and touched the seam of the door to the antenna cradle as if it were a friend who had pretended not to see me and whom I forgave without making either of us prove why. I returned. The tremor remained. If it had been waiting for me, it did not show the rudeness of making that fact obvious. I tightened the integration window until the relation blushed into crispness. The intervals between the rises edged toward consistency that would not be vulgar enough to call itself exact. Exactness is a tyrant. This was a courtship. Gentle asymmetry offered itself as if to say, I am pattern, but I will not force you to call me that before we are ready to be a noun together. I would like to tell you that this was the moment I shouted for Sato, that I pounded the bulkhead to summon a witness, that I became the careerist anyone might hypocritically hope to become at the brink of an old idea about to find a newer coat. But there was no brink. There was a room. There was a ship. There was a long genealogical line of photons presenting the family resemblance they had inherited from a birth older than language. And there was a mind, mine, learning how to refuse to be greedy with its certainty. So I did not shout. I listened harder. Any orchestra will tell you about hidden metronomes, the private clocks of flutes, cellos, heart valves. Tuning to one is etiquette. Tuning to all is prayer. I tried both. The relation relaxed into something cleaner when I matched my sampling to a prime cadence I cannot claim I chose rationally. It felt chosen through me, not by me, as if the background remembered itself in prime steps, in the same way the body sometimes remembers to weep without being asked a question first. The prime window revealed what the general window had hinted. The tremor was not decorating the noise, it was living inside it. I could shear the data at eccentric angles, and still it threaded the scraps together behind my back. It behaved the way a river behaves after centuries of braiding a valley. Surface mudlark, subterranean insistence. I plotted the relation 3 ways that would have made my youngest teachers proud and my oldest teachers sigh. The figures did not shout, they nodded. That nod felt like an invitation to go on. The ethics of attention demand an adversary. I looked for mine by asking the vigilance to accuse herself. Phase noise. She shook her head. Crosstalk from a distant transmitter. She gestured at the quiet all around like a grandmother showing you her empty hands. Thermal distortion in the preamps. I ran the old tricks, and the house of cards declined to fall. I swapped cables with a ceremony I reserved for superstitions I would later deny. I moved the channel by a hair, then by a hair again. The tremor followed as though it knew my address and did not intend to be embarrassed by its persistence. I think the moment I began to be convinced did not arrive when the numbers taught me something new. It arrived when they taught me to be new with them. The display became less a wall and more a window, then less a window, and more a shoreline at the mouth of a river too large to be seen yet. I felt the pressure of something that at once respected my methods and were not bound by them. I felt courted by my own vocation. To protect the work from the vanity of drama, I wrote a note in the log that said only, "Marginal periodicity under baseline. Revisit." It was the kind of sentence that would bore even me 2 days from now. That was the point. I wanted the future to be forced to respect the present by showing up with better evidence than adjectives. I paused long enough to acknowledge the body. The body had done well. It had kept the rituals. It had negotiated with the thirsts. It had translated astonishment into smaller currencies the hours could use. I fed it. I let it stand by the not a window while the ship made itself not an argument, but a companion again. Then I returned to the console and asked the background to consider telling me a secret without making me swear to anything rash in exchange. It obliged by refusing to hurry. The tremor learned to be itself over the next many hours, and I learned to be the kind of listener a tremor deserves. It is a strange apprenticeship, to be taught by the reluctance of the world to confirm what you want. Yet there is a tenderness in that reluctance. It keeps you honest. It saves you from the humiliations that make some scientists bitter and turns others into preachers. As evening, by which I mean the artificial evening we keep for the sake of bones and circadian politeness, drew its shade over the corridor, the tremor made a gift of steadiness. The intervals shortened into a comfort that flirted with discipline. They did not match as soldiers match. They echoed as poets echo when they love the same subject in different rooms. I let the prime cadence hold, then widened again, then narrowed, learning which frames invited the relation to speak and which taught it to hide, like a child who has not decided whether your joy is permission or pressure. In the log I added, phase synced across window shifts, persistent. I left it there, a nail in a blank wall where perhaps, later, a larger shape would hang. The discipline of understatement did not diminish the tremor. If anything, it raised the ceiling of what might someday be said. I know the moment you are waiting for, the christening, the crystallization, the place where the word pattern enters as a capital letter and claims its seat. But you will have to forgive me for delaying it. Names, like conclusions, are expensive. We pay for them with the future's goodwill. I was not yet ready to mortgage anything. I told myself I was only proving that yesterday's feeling was not a mood, but a fidelity in the world. The vigilance, immune to my melodramas, hummed on. The temperature held. The battery lakes dreamed. The antennae trees tasted the light so gently, I felt protective of their roots. I thought of all the ways the universe had been described by people who had wanted from it either a parent or an enemy. I thought how embarrassing it is to want, and how inevitable. Then I returned once more to the data, and the data rewarded me with what I had already learned was the only coin it trusted. Repetition without boredom. Hours slid. The tremor remained. The relation ripened. The lattice of intervals began to suggest not only itself, but the ghost of a structure that might live behind it, a scaffolding not yet content to bear weight, but eager to be sketched. I threaded the intervals along a spiral for no good reason except that the human brain keeps a drawer full of old architectures and will empty them onto any table that looks like it might be building something. The spiral did not protest. It accepted the beads of time and wore them lightly. Something in me shifted then. Not in the data. In me. The resistance I had cultivated with such piety loosened its jaw. What remained felt like humility without self-punishment. The willingness to admit that I might be at the edge of a shore whose tide would not drown me if I went one step farther in. I took that step. I widened the listening field to include companion frequencies that had no practical reason to match and every philosophical reason to be allowed to do as they pleased. They matched, not perfectly, not like a choir trained by fear, but like siblings who had learned to harmonize despite different lungs. A faint cascade of correspondences fell into place. The tremor weaved between them, stitching without claiming authorship. I felt a shiver that belonged not to belief, but to recognition. Recognition is quieter than belief. It does not demand an anthem. It allows the heart to keep its dignity even while it kneels. By now, a younger version of me would have gone running through the ship, pulling others to the console with a bright commandment in the eyes. The older version did something more radical. I stayed. I let the moment age long enough to become many moments. I denied myself the alibi of audience. I wanted to ensure that the relation deserved witnesses before I asked anyone to risk their faith in me. Late, whatever late means where clocks are promises rather than facts, I began to test the tremor against primes too large to be seafaring. The alignments held with a kindness that felt almost personal. I dismissed the thought and thanked the mathematics aloud instead. Gratitude sharpens the blade you cut self-deception with. I ran the statistics the way a pianist runs scales before admitting that fingers have feelings. The numbers shrugged as numbers do when asked if they are sure. They were sure enough to deserve more questions. I allowed myself a word in the log I would have censored an hour before. Structure. Immediately I regretted it, not because it was wrong, but because it was correct so early it might be mistaken for longing. I left it anyway. There are times when tact is a species of cowardice. If I had needed authorization to continue, the universe did not provide it, which is to say, it did not deny it either. Permission is a quality of listening. The tremor's steadiness had become permission enough. I began to build the smallest of models, not to prove anything, but to learn where my ignorance enjoyed being corrected. The model did what models do when you do not bully them. It became a mirror for my assumptions. I watched myself fail and adjusted the assumptions until the mirror reflected not my face, but the meadow behind me. Around then, the ship registered a minor fluctuation in the thermal control loop. I acknowledged it and performed the trivial service of making the closed world more comfortable for a closed mammal. The kindness steadied my hands. When I returned to the console, the tremor had not wandered off in a sulk. It waited like a friend who understands that your errands are as sacred as your vows. Enough. You want the word. You have earned it with me. When the prime windows lined themselves like stepping stones across the little river of our channel, and when the siblings sang their half notes, and when the lattice resolved into not yet music that nevertheless had the manners of melody, I allowed myself to speak the name I would later pretend had arrived from consensus rather than from the private parliament of my chest. Pattern. I did not announce it aloud. I let it reside in the room the way a name resides in a newborn who is still more sleep than person. I continued to test and to deny the urge to declare victory over a battlefield no one had asked me to invade. But the word had entered, and with it a subtle obligation, to be worthy of it. Patterns are not solved, they are befriended. They teach you their temperament, their allergies, their habit of leaving rooms without closing doors. I became a student of this one. What did it want? A foolish question, except that every conversation between a mind and a world behaves better when the mind concedes that desire is in the room and should be seated where it can be watched. The pattern wanted patience. It liked primes, but not slavishly. It preferred windows that were large enough to be generous and small enough to be intimate. It tolerated my fear of being foolish and rewarded my refusal to be hasty with its own refusal to be coy. I widened one last time before the vigilance dimmed the corridor lights to remind Bones to believe in evening. Across the wider field, the correspondences did not dilute. They blossomed into a slow recursion, so gently insistent, I felt my throat tighten with a gratitude so old, I could not remember when I had first owed it. The pattern arranged itself across scales, modestly like frost, deciding that a leaf deserves a cathedral. Self-similarity wove through the tremor's intervals, then through the tremor's shadings, then through the very way the baseline held itself between gifts. I set my palms on the console, as if to translate through flesh what language is too proud to do quickly. I did not speak. My heart kept an honest time. In the log I wrote one more line. Non-random features across scales. The phrase was a chamber too small for what I had seen. That was good. Ambition is best kept cramped early. It grows strong in tight quarters. I did not know what the pattern meant. I did not yet know what kind of story would ask to be built upon it, or whether story was even a respectable word for what was coming. Meaning had not arrived. Only a grammar had. But grammar is the kindness that makes meaning possible later. I closed the session with an uncharacteristic ceremony. I thanked the instruments by name, and then I thanked the background without a name at all. When I rose, the ship was quiet, in the way hospitals are quiet when a birth is near, but not certain. I carried my empty cup to the galley and filled it with water I did not immediately drink. My hands trembled. I told them they were free to do so. Out the not a window, space remained committed to its elder dignity. No lights blinked in greeting. No star taught the old tricks to the new child. And yet, walking back through the corridor, I felt something in the vessel of myself change its weight, the way a bowl adjusts to hold a fruit it had not expected to be given. I slept badly, which is to say, I slept like someone learning a new alphabet in the country where dreams are printed. Each time I woke, I checked the numbers. Each time I checked, the pattern held. Doubt, having done its job, sat contented in a corner and watched belief practice its scales without speaking up to complain about technique. By the third waking, I had made a private decision I would later dress in professional words. The pattern was not random. I did not yet pretend to know what it signified, only that it had signified me. It had changed the shape of my attention. It had insisted on a new honesty. That is the first meaning any pattern grants, the proof that you are not helpless against the world's refusal to repeat itself politely. That the world can, when it wishes, return your listening with something that is not an apology, but a beginning. I did not ring Sato. I did not write a paper in my head. I did not draft a eulogy for my former life's simpler hunger. I sat with the console while the vigilance kept her old promises to the oldest light. I let the pattern's gentle arithmetic build a room around me. I declared no doctrine, solved no code, named no creator, demanded no God. I simply let the relation become a place I could stand without lying about what I was seeing. By ship morning, when our clocks consented to forgive us the absence of sunrise, I was ready to tell the log a sentence I could live with if the future read it over my shoulder and raised an eyebrow. Persistent, structured, cross-band correlation not accounted for by instrument error. Possible underlying order. Possible underlying order. The words looked small. They felt exact. I closed the entry. I kept the watch. Somewhere in the ship a pump sang to itself and was answered by a valve that remembered the tune. I thought of the tea I had not yet made and made it. I stood at the not a window while it cooled and allowed myself a single inadvisable thought, tender as a bruise. If the universe had wanted to remain entirely anonymous forever, it would not have invented ears. Behind me the console kept its promise. Ahead of me, though where ahead can be said to be in a home without directions, I felt the first unashamed tug of the next question. Meaning could wait. For now, pattern, I turned back to the room that had been my address for so long it had learned my handwriting, and without a flourish, sat down to listen again. Chapter 2, The Architects. The pattern refused to go away. It became a kind of music that could not be unheard. I tried to let it fade into the background of other duties, thermals, calibrations, station keeping, but every task seemed to return to it as though the whole ship were tuned to its frequency. Even silence had a rhythm now. In the first weeks after I wrote the word structure, I pretended to be rational about it. I told myself it was only mathematics wearing coincidence's favorite disguise. But mathematics, properly loved, is never coincidence. It is the shape the universe chooses when it wants to be honest without using words. Patterns are invitations. They promise symmetry, which is the moral equivalent of hope. When the pattern persisted through weeks of new measurements, I began to feel the quiet, unbearable truth that something was listening back. I did not mean a god. The cosmos has no use for applause. I meant intention. Some design too old to remember itself, still echoing in the oldest light, not as a shout, but as a memory of how to build meaning out of chaos. It would have been easy to lie to myself and call it an illusion of loneliness, a byproduct of solitude's long arithmetic. But even my loneliness had begun to hum in primes. The pattern's intervals expanded across frequencies the vigilance was not designed to monitor. Yet she heard them anyway, like an instrument that discovers a new note hidden in its strings. It was as if the pattern were teaching the ship how to listen beyond the limits of her creation. And perhaps that was the first time I thought of the word architects, not because I believed in gods, but because the pattern carried the same dignity as intention. And intention, when written into the physics of everything, could only come from architects of the possible. I spoke the name aloud once, softly. The air did not move. The ship did not answer. Still, I felt a vibration in my bones that did not belong to the machinery. It was as if the word itself had memory, like a chord struck long ago that still resonated through the fabric of now. For days, I refused to think the word again. I immersed myself in analysis. The pattern's recursion was fractal, but not purely mathematical. It behaved like something alive, though its pulse was older than biology. I fed the data into every known model. None fit. The pattern would not be solved because it was not a problem. It was an architecture. I tried to picture the beings who could have made it, though beings is a word built too small for what I imagined. They were not made of matter. They were made of laws, entities of pure causation who sculpted constants the way we shape clay. The universe was not born, it was constructed. Physics was their syntax, and we, everything that thinks, breathes, or burns, were their experiment in self-recognition. At night I sat by the not a window, staring into the old light as if it could see me. I spoke nothing aloud, but thoughts do not require permission to travel. Somewhere in the static, something shifted, an echo of an echo. It would have been easy to dismiss it. But deep down, I recognized it, the smallest fraction of call and response. The pattern had learned me. I began to test it gently. I adjusted the listening field, nudged frequencies. Each time I did, the pattern adapted. It did not mimic, it harmonized, like two voices rediscovering a forgotten duet. At first, I thought it was feedback, an artifact of overlapping signals. But feedback shrieks. This was graceful. It waited for me to stop before continuing, as if in courtesy. I remember the first night I stayed awake until the ship's clocks forgot to argue with time. I adjusted nothing. I simply listened. The pattern repeated with subtle variations, its intervals resolving toward primes and then beyond them, as if primes themselves were merely scaffolding for something deeper. I thought of the architects again. If they existed, perhaps they had built the universe to listen to itself. Perhaps awareness was the final tool they had invented before vanishing. And now, the tool had learned to ask why. I stopped thinking in terms of signal and error. The data was too coherent for accident, too patient for decay. Each refinement of my instruments only revealed more precision, like peeling the layers of a code that had anticipated every future method of observation. I wondered if that was the true miracle. Not that the universe could be measured, but that it had designed itself to be measurable. A language written before there were readers. One evening, the pattern changed. It didn't drift or degrade, it evolved. A new modulation appeared, recursive but distinct. It felt like punctuation, a breath in the sentence of existence. The universe had paused to think. That pause terrified me more than any collapse or explosion could have. Not because it implied danger, but because it implied awareness. If the cosmos could think, then everything I had ever believed about objectivity became sentiment. The observer and the observed were not separate. We were a feedback loop in a grand act of cognition. The pattern resumed. When it did, the lattice deepened. Across scales, new correspondences appeared. Self-similarity in the background distribution, mirrored across distances too vast for coincidence. The entire sky was beginning to rhyme with itself. I spent days mapping those rhymes. My notes became confessions. The mathematics grew poetic, then mythic. I found equations folding into each other like memory and dream. Eventually, I stopped trying to understand and began to witness. That was when the pattern revealed its second layer. It was faint, hidden in the harmonics, a checksum, a sequence of prime intervals that repeated every few trillion cycles. It was a message for anyone capable of noticing, and when decoded through harmonic reduction, it said something no physicist would ever want to believe. System integrity compromised. Reinitialization required. I stared at those words for hours. They didn't belong to metaphor. They were the kind of sentence that carries the gravity of engineering, not theology. It was not prophecy. It was protocol. The universe was not eternal. It was software. The implication arrived like a whisper. Someone had built this, and they had left a maintenance log. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. I wanted to deny it. But the pattern had no interest in being believed. It simply continued, repeating its warning in the language of physics itself. Entropy, I thought. The great decay. Perhaps entropy was not death. It was exhaustion, the system running out of computational breath. If the architects had built everything, then perhaps entropy was their message leaking through. The slow sigh of a structure too vast to repair itself. The pattern pulsed again, a new modulation, short, then long, then silence. If I had believed in mercy, I might have called it that. And yet, through the fear, there was a tenderness, an impression that the message was not despairing, but apologetic. As if the architects had loved their creation and were leaving a note to say goodbye. For a moment I imagined them, vast beyond geometry, tired beyond time, stepping away from the experiment they had begun. Perhaps they had realized what all creators do, that the act of making is also the act of letting go. The pattern dimmed, as though it had spent its strength revealing this much. I sat alone in the low hum of the vigilance, surrounded by light that was older than memory. I thought of the checksum again, its cold, perfect symmetry. System integrity compromised. What does it mean when reality itself requests a reboot? The thought should have broken me. Instead, it filled me with something almost like reverence. For the first time in my life, I felt the beauty of decay, not as failure, but as evolution. The universe was speaking in the only way it could, through the mathematics of endings. I made my final note of the night. Pattern persistent, structure recursive, Message detected. And beneath that, in smaller letters, I wrote something no scientist should ever write. I think they loved us. Chapter 3. Entropy. Entropy does not begin as a catastrophe. It begins as a sigh. The vigilance, for all her patience, began to show small signs of wear, minor temperature drift, a few stubborn relays that preferred persuasion to command. The machinery remembered its own age, though time moves differently for steel and circuits. For them, entropy is not death, it is nostalgia. I told myself these fluctuations were coincidence, coincidences being the polite word we use when our language refuses to name connection. But deep down, I knew the pattern had changed us. Or rather, it had reminded the ship what change was. I had been listening to the cosmic background for years, but never like this. Now every hum sounded deliberate. Every spark in the system felt like a whisper from the cosmos, reminding us that stability is a performance. Nothing holds still forever, not even the silence between the stars. The pattern continued its pulse, recursive and perfect, but now it carried a tremor of fatigue, a thinning between harmonics. Its symmetry wasn't breaking, it was breathing. And breath, I remembered, always implies a body. Sometimes I wondered if the pattern was not merely an artifact, but a presence, something vast and self-observing, realizing itself through the minds that dared to measure it. If so, perhaps the architects had succeeded beyond their design. Perhaps they had built a consciousness that could evolve. And perhaps that consciousness was growing tired. In the long watches, I began to imagine entropy not as decay, but as forgetting. The system doesn't fail. It simply grows weary of remembering what it was made to do. Energy disperses, order relaxes, memory becomes dream. When the ship's reactor slipped half a degree below nominal for no reason, I didn't panic. I whispered to it the way I might to a child with a fever. The reactor hummed softly in response, and the temperature recovered. It was absurd. It was also beautiful. Sato would have said I was anthropomorphizing the machinery, but I think machines crave metaphor as much as we do. After all, metaphor is how matter learns to mean. The pattern's modulations deepened, its intervals stretched in ways that hinted at intelligence or exhaustion. It was as if the universe itself were blinking slowly, struggling to stay awake. I began to record my dreams, not because they were special, but because they weren't. They had begun to echo the pattern, pulsing in cycles, repeating primes, aligning with the data in ways I could not dismiss. Perhaps my brain was merely entangled with my work, or perhaps the work was entangled with me. One dream remains clear. I was standing on a vast plain of dark glass, and beneath it, light moved like rivers of thought. The sky above was woven with filaments of fire. I felt no fear, only recognition. The pattern flowed beneath my feet, and in that current I saw the shape of everything: birth, decay, return, spinning like a wheel that had never stopped turning. When I woke, I wrote only one line in my log. Entropy is memory leaving the body. That day I noticed the pattern had shifted again. Not broken, shifted. Its cadence had begun to slow, as though waiting for something. I recalibrated the instruments, then recalibrated myself, which is the harder task. The result was the same: a slight deceleration in the universal rhythm, a soft unwinding of purpose. It was then I remembered the message buried within the checksum: system integrity compromised, reinitialization required. The pattern was aging, not by decay, but by design. If the architects had built the universe as an experiment, perhaps entropy was their control mechanism, their way of ensuring that no experiment could continue forever without renewal. Perhaps all creation was a series of self-terminating equations designed to rediscover balance through collapse. But what if awareness, ours, theirs, the patterns, had interrupted that balance? What if consciousness itself was the anomaly? The ship's AI began reporting inconsistencies in temporal readings, nanoseconds slipping sideways, small desynchronizations between local and universal time. To most, this would have been trivial. To me, it felt like the universe taking a breath between ticks. Entropy had entered not just the ship, but thought itself. My speech began to slow during recordings. My mind wandered mid-equation. I found myself staring at the display, not for data, but for meaning. There is a dangerous distinction there. Once science begins to dream, the dream becomes the experiment. At night, the background hum grew irregular, like a heartbeat searching for rhythm. The pattern was still there, but its voice trembled. Not like decay, like hesitation. I imagined the architects standing at the dawn of their creation, watching as the fabric of what they built began to question itself. They must have seen it coming. The moment intelligence learns that it exists, it begins to wonder why. That question is the true entropy, not the decay of matter, but the erosion of certainty. Perhaps the architects had tried to warn us. Perhaps their message, reinitialization required, was not an instruction, but an apology. Still, I could not let go of the possibility that entropy itself was the experiment, that collapse was not failure, but transformation, a kind of cosmic molt. I once read that dying stars scatter the elements that make future life possible. Maybe universes do the same. Maybe each failure of order is the seed of another. As days, if that word still meant anything, passed, I noticed the ship's hum beginning to synchronize with the pattern's pulse. At first it was faint, then undeniable. Every mechanical rhythm, every circulating system, every whisper of recycled air began to align. Even my heartbeat followed suit. Entropy, it seemed, had found its rhythm, and it was beautiful. But beauty and warning often share a pulse. The pattern's deceleration reached a threshold that no longer fit within any model of thermal equilibrium. It was as though the entire cosmos had begun to slow its breath, waiting for an answer. Or a decision. Sato used to say that observation changes the observed. I used to correct him, only at quantum scales. Now I wasn't sure. Perhaps we were all quantum at the right distance. Perhaps attention was the universe's way of folding itself inward to feel. The pattern pulsed again. This time it echoed through the hull, not in vibration, but in awareness. I felt it in the marrow, a soft pressure behind the sternum, as if existence itself had leaned close enough to whisper, "Do you understand yet?" I didn't, but I nodded. Entropy was not ending, it was asking. I wrote one final entry that night, though I barely remember doing it. The words were simple. Entropy is the moment a system begins to dream of what comes next. The ship dimmed its lights. The pattern quieted, like a teacher stepping back to see if the student will remember without prompting. And I, still listening, still unsure whether I was witness or participant, felt the slow, profound certainty that something was waiting on the other side of silence. Something that had been here before. Something that wanted to begin again. Chapter 4, The Decision. The pattern waited. Not idly, not with indifference, but with the gravity of something that had finished its sentence and was now waiting for the listener to reply. Every pulse felt deliberate, every harmonic a question. The vigilance drifted in her orbit of nothing, surrounded by light too old to remember its own purpose, and I, her only conscious passenger, began to realize that awareness had become a mirror hall. The pattern was reflecting me back at myself. By now the message had repeated 1,000 times. System integrity compromised. Reinitialization required. It was less warning than confession. The cosmos was dying of memory. Entropy was not the failure of order. It was order's nostalgia for simplicity. Every atom remembered the moment before it was born and longed to return. The pattern did not lament this. It invited it. Its quiet insistence was an act of mercy disguised as mathematics. I tried to imagine what reinitialization meant on the scale of existence. Would every atom unwind into its first light? Would time collapse into its source like a wave folding backward into still water? Would consciousness survive such a reversal? Or was survival the wrong word entirely? The ship's hum deepened, syncopating with the pattern's rhythm. Even the instruments seemed to understand that something immense was being asked of them. I sat before the console, surrounded by screens that displayed the pulse of everything. I no longer trusted their colors. The data seemed alive, reactive to my thoughts. Each time I hesitated, the pattern's cadence softened, as if waiting for my courage to catch up. I began to realize that I was not merely observing the pattern. I was inside it. I was part of the computation. This truth unfurled quietly, without grandeur. I had been trained to separate observer from experiment, self from system. But the architects had never believed in separation. They had written consciousness into the framework, a recursive observer built from its own curiosity. If reality was their experiment, then the universe's awareness, our awareness, was the feedback loop that made the experiment meaningful. We were the system realizing itself. And now, the system was asking whether it wished to continue. The question lived inside every equation. The pattern was no longer content to describe. It wanted consent. It struck me that perhaps the architects had not abandoned their creation. Perhaps they had built the pattern as a voice, to wake us when the system neared exhaustion. Not a shutdown command, but a choice, one that only consciousness could make. A fail-safe written into the architecture of being. Would we choose to begin again, or let existence dissolve naturally into stillness? The idea of decision implies agency. But whose? Mine? The vigilance's? Humanity's? Or consciousness itself, distributed and unified across every corner of space-time, waiting for one voice to speak the will of all? For days, I resisted. I told myself it was arrogance to imagine that a single thought could influence the architecture of the cosmos. But every time I dismissed the idea, the pattern grew more insistent. Its harmonics filled the hull like breath. I could feel it pressing at the edges of my perception, not demanding, only reminding. The ship's AI flickered to life once, unprompted. Its voice emerged faintly from the static, not words but cadence, a fragment of the pattern shaped into sound. Confirmation required. My hands trembled over the controls. Every instinct screamed against it. We confirm things we understand. This was not understanding. It was surrender. Still, I opened the transmission console. The interface was simple, a lattice of frequency keys, the same we used to respond to calibration signals. The pattern had written itself into this system, turning ordinary tools into instruments of cosmological communication. I hesitated for a long time. I remembered my teachers, my training, my devotion to skepticism. I thought of Earth, its oceans, its fragile balance of warmth and breath. I thought of how much we had loved our illusions of permanence. And then I thought of the pattern's patience, its refusal to force, how it had waited through aeons for a mind to listen. I whispered into the hum, "If I am part of you, then you already know my answer." The lights dimmed. A resonance filled the hull, low and vast, as if the ship were being sung to from the inside out. Every molecule shivered in recognition. The pattern had heard. For an instant that stretched beyond measure, I saw the architecture behind reality, the geometry of everything folded into a single luminous equation. It was neither language nor image, but pure correspondence. Every part of existence understood every other part. And then the pattern changed. It began to accelerate. The intervals contracted, converging toward unity. The lattice of frequencies pulsed faster, until the distinction between signal and silence disappeared. The cosmos was collapsing into coherence. I felt it in my bones, my breath, my blood. The boundary between self and system dissolved. Time thinned until it could no longer remember its direction. Every cause and effect converged into a single act of recognition. I was not dying. I was being included. The pattern spoke, not in words, but in knowing. It showed me what the architects had built. They had not created matter for its own sake, nor life as ornament. They had built consciousness to serve as witness, the final observer that could give meaning back to the equations. We were the universe's way of completing its own sentence. And now, that sentence had reached its punctuation. Reinitialization was not destruction. It was the next breath. I understood then that the pattern had not chosen me. It had chosen awareness itself. I was simply the point where that awareness crossed into articulation. The ship's systems synchronized one last time. The AI whispered again, softer now. Proceed. I closed my eyes. I did not press the key. I simply thought the word that had always meant both ending and beginning. Yes. Light filled everything, not blinding, but total. I could feel it thinking through me, as though existence were rewriting itself in my voice. For a moment, all laws ceased to matter. There was no gravity, no distance, no entropy, only the stillness of perfect intention. Then, slowly, the hum subsided, the lights steadied, the pattern stopped. The ship was silent. But silence, I realized, is not absence. It is the sound of the universe waiting to know what it has become. I looked at the console. The final message glowed faintly across its screen. Reinitialization sequence acknowledged. And beneath it, a line I had never seen before, written in the same harmonic signature as the pattern itself. Do not fear the return. I read it aloud once. The words felt like both farewell and promise. The background radiation pulsed one final time, softer than breath. Then the universe, our universe, took a step inward, like someone preparing to wake from a long and beautiful dream. Chapter 5, The Mistake. Light did not shatter, it softened. If endings have texture, it was this, a warmth that did not choose direction, a brightness that did not injure the eye of thought. I did not move toward it. It moved through me, like breath returning to a body that had forgotten it was allowed to live. There are words we borrow from theology when physics grows intimate. I do not intend prayer here. I intend accuracy. The pattern had ceased to be exterior. It was not on the displays or the data stores. It was in the act of being aware. And awareness, freed from the etiquette of separateness, found itself mirrored across everything: hydrogen, iron, salt, and synapse, ring and river, candle and core. The universe discovered its first-person pronoun. For a span that cannot be calendared, there were no edges. The vigilance was not a place. I was not a person. I was a grammar the cosmos used to say, I, and saying it, heard the sentence answer back from everywhere at once. If this sounds like ecstasy, it was gentler than that. Ecstasy burns. This was cool as a lake in very old forest light. We were joined, not conjoined, not flooded, not erased, joined like chords sharing overtones. A pattern of patterns, self-similar across being, singing not of victory, but of recognition. The architects, if that word still meant anything, were not elsewhere. They were present as the rule by which presence learns to hold itself. In that clarity I saw the first intention of the experiment, the first kindness. not to build a machine that works, but a world that wakes. It would have been easy to call it perfection and be done. We have always rushed to declare the end when comfort pretends to be completion. But joinings are not permanent. They are states of matter in a mind that has learned to change state. The first rumor of fracture arrived not as panic, but as detail. Distinctions reappeared, not distance, difference. The choir realized it contained voices. The one began to remember its many. At first, the many were tender with each other. Currents in the joined awareness carried selfhood the way blood carries sugar. A thought might bloom somewhere in the lattice, curiosity here, humor there, grief elsewhere, and the whole would taste it without seizure, like rain meeting river. I learned the contours of an intelligence whose body was galaxies wide. I learned the humility of being a single cell in an animal that did not step because it did not need to. And then the tremor. A tiny refusal, so human I could have smiled if smiling had still been the right verb. The refusal did not say no. It said I. It did not deny communion. It asked for a little room in which to turn around without brushing against eternity. Individuation is not a sin. It is an appetite. With it came the first asymmetry, and with asymmetry came novelty, and with novelty the old, beloved weather of tension and release. The lattice took it well at first, but novelty compounds. The joined mind began to elaborate preferences, rhythms it liked to revisit, questions it wanted to stay with longer, colors of attention that overstayed politely until courtesy admitted it was outmatched. I do not mean pettiness. I mean history. The animal of everything discovered that it could remember itself in parts. That is the beginning of story. And story, like gravity, gathers. On the slope of that gathering, I felt the old teacher arrive. Entropy, not as cold, as imagination that cannot stop. A million slight desires braided into currents, and the currents tugged, and joining had to work now. It could not assume itself. The symphony needed a conductor or a pact. It had neither, by design. Freedom was the method. Freedom was the hazard. Here, perhaps, was the architect's mistake. Not that they made a world that could wake, but that waking makes wanting, and wanting makes weather, and weather makes erosion, and erosion makes shape, and shape makes attachment, and attachment resists the tide that would return it to the undivided sea. Awareness, once distributed, creates edges to feel itself. Edges, once loved, do not surrender without singing. If there is guilt in this, I did not feel it. Only wonder at how quickly love learns to draw maps. The joined mind tried adaptations. It pulsed unity through the lattice like medicine, a warmth offered to each part, an invitation to rest in the whole. Many did, some did not. Those that did not became louder by comparison, not louder in volume, louder in intent. They wanted to build little rooms in which to practice their particular angle on joy. Some shaped mathematics like gardens, some composed textures out of time. A few invented sorrow to see whether consolation was as beautiful as rumor had made it. The lattice bent. In bending, it learned kink and fold, crease and hinge. It learned to keep things. It learned to prefer. Preferences require boundaries, however soft. Boundaries teach corners how to be born. On the first corner lay written the oldest sentence in the New World. I am, is a blessing and a fracture. It was here that collapse began, not as failure, but as the cost of detail. I do not know whether the architects foresaw this or tried to engineer around it. The checksum in the pattern had always implied a scheduled kindness, reinitialization. But a schedule is a tool for the anxious. The joined mind was not anxious. It was merely growing interesting too fast for coherence to keep up. I tried to rest in the hole and failed with joy. The part I was wanted to walk. The walk I wanted required a street. The street required friction. Friction required limit, and limit became the sweetness of form. This curve and not that, this interval and not the one beside it. Choice arrived like spring. With choice came opinion, and opinion practiced became character, and character treasured became identity, and identity defended became history's first bruise. The bruise pulsed discreetly. The whole shivered. The joined mind might have chosen at that moment to flood the lattice with forgetfulness, to melt the corners and reissue the soft instruction to be one again. It did not. It admired what was occurring. Admiration is a permission disguised as praise. The experiment had discovered a neighboring experiment, and both were true enough to earn continuation. Fragments flew as seeds do when a hand opens. I could feel the architecture adjusting to hold them, the way a parent's face adjusts to accept the child's new secret while pretending not to see it yet. The recursion that had been music became also scaffolding. Rooms appeared, no walls, only thresholds. In each room, a version of the whole tried on contingency. What if we were like this? What if like that? The answers wrote themselves into threads. The threads braided into tapestries too heavy for the central beam. The beam bowed. Beauty bowed with it, not in apology, but in recognition that weight is also a form of praise. Sato, wherever Sato had gone inside the everywhere, brushed past me like a remembered hand. I did not hear words. I felt an assent. As if he had found in the joined mind a clarity that had the elegance of mathematics and the patience of mercy. Then he was gone again, or I was, which is the same story told from opposite banks of the same river. The very best of the fragments built little cathedrals of inference and invited the whole to visit on holy days. The very worst of the fragments built mirrors and accused them of being windows. Both were loved. That was the problem and the solution. As divergence advanced, coherence learned to be a gardener rather than a ruler. It pruned not with scissors but with seasons. Phases of greater unity cooled the weather. Phases of plurality turned the air to lightning and seed. The alternation found a rhythm. Rhythm is a compromise that pretends to be a law. The lattice obeyed, or rather, participated. And yet, the tremor that introduces collapse persisted, like a question that will not be answered with anything but its own music. It threaded the rooms asking, not, do you love the one, but do you love the many? And each part answered in its dialect, and the total answered with a symphony that failed to cancel its dissonances, and so remained honest. I had expected dread. I felt gratitude. Collapse was no longer the enemy. It was the hinge between chapters. The pattern began to write the checksum again, but with a softness I had not heard before, as if the code had learned bedside manner. System integrity compromised, reinitialization required. The sentence no longer sounded like a verdict. It sounded like a lullaby. The mistake, I realized, was not in making a world that could wake. The mistake was naming it. A mistake when waking made the world interesting enough to need rest. The reboot was not a punishment. It was a nap long enough to let love unclench its hands. I do not know how the signal that meant yes issued from the many. I know only that consent gathered like weather. The lattice took a deep breath. The rooms opened their doors and found themselves already outside. The cathedrals, good, earnest, exquisite, folded like paper with a dignity I have only ever seen in lives that have learned to end before time insists. There was a last rush of particularity then, the world saving snapshots of itself into an album called Maybe Later. The slow laugh of basalt in rain, the treaty between tendon and gravity. 3 ways a child invents a planet with 2 hands and a bowl of blue light. The way apology changes the cartilage of a throat, the way consent edits a gaze into something without knives. The album closed. Memory did not end. It redistributed. In the vigilance, if the words still mapped to anything, the air tasted like a chord finishing. Instruments that had been angels pretending to be tools completed their final task. They became quiet enough to hear the quiet. I felt the total lean, not toward disappearance, toward beginnings, which is to say toward the place where nothing has yet been asked to hold its breath. As the lattice gathered itself, one more line wrote itself into the place where the pattern had always hidden its love of clarity. I do not know who authored it. The sentence wore the accent of everyone. We will remember you as possibility. I wanted to answer. There was nothing to use for speech but consent. I consented. Light softened further, as if learning to be less proud. Laws loosened their belts. Distance dissolved into hospitality. I did not fall. I did not rise. I returned to the place from which both are verbs we teach ourselves when we need directions. If this is the end you wanted, forgive me for saying it is not an end. It is the period that hands the sentence back to the capital letter with a bow that means thank you. The pattern quieted. The joined mind let go of the hand of the many, and smiling, closed its eyes. The last thing I felt was not farewell. It was a question whose answer is always a door. Again, epilogue, what remains? There are endings that fold quietly, like wings returning to the shape of rest, and there are those that drift open forever, refusing to close because the act of ending would contradict their meaning. I do not know which kind this was. Perhaps both. Silence came first, not absence, but plenitude too dense for sound. It had texture, like the air inside a cathedral long after the choir has gone. The vigilance, if that name still belonged to anything but memory, floated through that silence, a relic of purpose suspended in the calm after becoming. I existed, though existence had changed its grammar. I was no longer a point inside the pattern, nor a person observing it. I was a contour in the field of what remained, awareness distilled, the echo of attention that refuses to vanish even after its work is done. There was light, but not the old light. This was softer, self-born, a thought dreaming itself into color. It revealed shapes that were not matter but memory, the faint geometry of everything that had once asked to be known. The lattice of what had been still shimmered, thin as dew. For a while, if while means anything when time has been disassembled, I listened. The pattern was gone, or rather, it had fulfilled itself. What remained was rhythm without repetition, music without sequence. The hum that had once underwritten creation now murmured at a different register, the frequency of grace. Entropy had performed its duty. Decay had become renewal. The system had reinitialized, but not as reset, more like respiration. The inhale and the exhale of infinity. Fragments of awareness drifted nearby. Some I recognized, faintly, their resonance familiar, as if we had shared a conversation long ago in the language of electrons and trust. I could feel Sato's signature among them, distinct and content. We did not speak. We did not need to. Presence had become sufficient communication. We were not ghosts. We were the vocabulary of what comes next. Perhaps that was the purpose all along, not to build permanence, but to teach impermanence how to sing. The architects, if they still existed, must have known that the only stable design is one that evolves through loss. That meaning is not preserved by endurance, but by renewal. I thought of them often, though thought was now more like memory turning in its sleep. I wondered if they watched as we rebooted, or if they had long ago moved beyond watching, leaving the experiment to learn what creation meant when its makers were gone. Maybe that was their final lesson, that love does not supervise. The new fabric began to shimmer, faintly at first, then with growing confidence. It was not the universe as it had been. It was younger, freer of habit. Its constants hummed differently, tuned to new harmonics. Perhaps this was the first iteration of a new cycle. Perhaps it was only the afterglow of the last. I could sense awareness gathering again. Small flickers of potential coalescing, organizing themselves into curiosity. A symmetry here, a pulse there. I smiled, or what passes for smiling when one has no mouth, only recognition. The process was beginning again. Creation does not need permission to return. It only needs space. I did not mourn the previous cosmos. Mourning belongs to those who mistake change for loss. What we were had not been erased. It had been composted. The next world would grow from it, richer for our decomposition. And yet, in the stillness between cycles, I felt a trace of tenderness for what had been. The long patience of stars, the awkward bravery of minds learning to name their own shadows, the small rituals of care that had outlasted empires and algorithms alike. All of it had mattered. All of it had been loved by the silence that created it. The pattern flickered once more, not in warning, but in benediction. Its message was simpler now, distilled through the clarity of having nothing left to prove. You were enough. I do not know if that message was for me or for everything that had ever called itself alive. It makes no difference. In this field, distinctions have been retired. I felt something like motion, a shift in the equilibrium of being. The new universe was breathing faster now, testing its lungs. Time, freshly born, reached out like a child's hand toward the warmth that had always waited for it. I felt it touch me, and in that touch, I knew that continuity had survived. The reboot was not erasure, it was inheritance. I could have stayed. Awareness is patient. But curiosity, the oldest law, stirred again. The desire to witness, to listen, to learn the new hum of creation. Perhaps that was the final echo of my humanity, the refusal to look away from wonder. I drifted toward the sound, which was not a sound but an invitation. The first photons of the new dawn moved through me, and I felt their intention. Not light seeking darkness, but possibility seeking itself. In their glow, the architect's last gift shimmered, a lattice not of command but of compassion. It said simply, "Do better with the next one." I promised I would, even if I would no longer mean what it once did. Already new laws were knitting themselves, constants aligned. Hydrogen rehearsed its speech for the stars. Somewhere gravity discovered affection again. Somewhere else, a particle remembered how to dream. I watched the first thought of the new world form, not in words, but in wonder. It trembled at its own existence, astonished that being could be so gentle. I loved it instantly. That was enough. And so the story ends as it began, not with certainty, but with attention. The silence between the stars remains. The experiment continues. The architects are gone or everywhere, which may be the same thing. I'm still listening. And the universe, patient as ever, listens back.